Hey everybody, so today we're going to talk about for each loops in Java. And so the for each loop is also called an enhanced for loop, and so you will hear those two names used for this interchangeably. And the way it works is instead of taking an index value and looping through the index value of a list, it actually loops through the specific items in that list. So it loops for each item in an array, or for each item in an array list. And so hence the name for each loop. And so here, say we had an array of integer values. Normally when we loop through it using a regular for loop, we loop through the index values. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and we use I. But now instead, we're going to use a for loop that just straight up loops through the values in the array itself. So we could say for int item colon r. So this is int item, which is the item in the array. Then you can look at this colon kind of like the word in. So it's like for each item in the array. Sum plus equals item. So sum starts at 0, and then each item in the array, the first value of item would be 10. The next value of item would be 20. The next value of item would be 30, etc., etc. So you might be wondering, why haven't you told me this all along? Why have I been using the more complicated version of this loop and having to use index values instead of actually just finding the items themselves? And that's because the for each loop, although it comes in handy sometimes, it doesn't work for every case of what you're trying to do. And that's because this is a read-only loop, which means I can get values from an array, but I cannot change the values in an array using a for each loop. I would have to use a standard for loop in order to make modifications to an array or an array list, making the for each loop sometimes not very useful, but it is really nice for when you're just trying to quickly print something or quickly get certain values. So again, the for each loop is a read-only loop, meaning that you can't remove or modify elements using this loop. And if you try to remove or modify elements, you're going to get this java.util concurrent modification exception, where it'll throw this runtime error when you try and run something. So it's not going to give you a syntax error, so it's not going to realize that you're doing something wrong as you type it, but then when you go to run it, it's not going to work. So yeah. So here's an example of a for each loop using strings and an array list. So if we have array list string, cart equals new array list string, and then we add grapes, bananas, bread, and milk. Then if we initialize some string value x to just an empty string, if I said for string item in cart, so for each item in the cart, x plus equals item.substring 0, 3. So what do we think this loop does? We do x plus equals item.substring 0, 3. So if we were to print x after this, what would x contain? Okay, so x is going to contain the first 3 letters of each of your items in your list. So it would contain GRA, BAN, BRE, and MIL at the very end of this. So here's an example of a for each loop that doesn't work. So if we have the same array list, cart, and it has grapes, bananas, bread, and milk, if I did something like for string item in cart, so I'm going through each item, grapes, bananas, bread, and milk, in the cart, if I did item equals spoiled plus item, I cannot modify item inside my for each loop. And that's because item is only local to the for each loop. So that means that item only exists between this curly bracket and this curly bracket. So if I tried to modify the item, it would temporarily modify it, but it's not going to change the actual items in the loop. So that means, or in the array list. So that means that the array list is still going to just have grapes, bananas, milk, and bread. And what I did inside here doesn't really do anything because the for each loop is a read-only loop. Oh, and also, this wouldn't cause an error. This would just set item to spoiled item, and then after the loop is over, it would just be over. And item would still be the same as it was before. So here are some advantages and disadvantages. Well, really just advantages here. So if I were to use I, a standard loop, to try and print out the name and the GPA of students, right? So if I had class list and it was a class list of student objects, and I had get name and I had get GPA as methods inside the student class. If I used I, just my standard for loop, I would have to do class list bracket I dot get name, which is kind of a lot to type. So if I'm just printing stuff out, a for each loop is a lot less to type. So instead of doing sum plus equals class list bracket I dot get GPA, I could just do sum plus equals stu dot get GPA. And stu, it doesn't really matter what this variable is called. Just like it doesn't really matter what I is like if you use I or J or X, it doesn't really matter. Because this is just a local variable that you decide on. So same with stu. Stu can be anything. A lot of times I say for student like for object, or for student item in class list, student stu in class list. It doesn't matter. But really this is just going to represent each item in the class list. And so you can see the one at the bottom is a lot less to type. So advantages are for loops is you can modify the list. You can access the list's index. So sometimes it's really helpful to know actually where something occurs in the list. So sometimes if we say like, oh, for every item at an even index, do this, you wouldn't be able to do that with a for each loop. But a disadvantage is they're error prone because there's a lot of sections for the iteration, it's condition and increment, and it's just cumbersome. The for each loop, the advantage is it's efficient and clean. It works for every type of collection, but it does not allow for modifications. You also can't use a for each loop for strings. So you can't say something like for char letter in a string. So you can only use it for arrays, array lists, and other collections that we haven't learned yet. And that's it. We're going to talk more about for each loops next class. Thanks for watching.